continuation to the ongoing series in the subject pharmaceutics and on the topic suppository dosage forms, principles and practices, today's session will cover different types of bases and methods of preparation with respect to suppository dosage form. I am Dr. Hema Chaudhary. As we have discussed in our previous two parts of the topic about the definition of suppositories, and also we have discussed the types of suppositories, and we have covered the advantages and disadvantages of suppository dosage form. Just to recapitulate what we have discussed till date, suppositories are semi-solid forms of dosages which are to be inserted into body cavities. Now, the body cavity could be the rectum, the vagina, it could be nose, ear or urethra. So, as we have been talking about different types of suppositories, a suppository can be meant to be inserted into a rectum or vagina or urethra as the case may be. The suppositories are formulated by taking suitable bases. In order to look into or delve into the different types of bases which are useful in formulating such dosage forms, it is important to understand what are the ideal characteristics of suppository bases. So, to begin the session, we will be touching upon different ideal characteristics of a suppository base. As the human body temperature is 37 degrees centigrade, it is very important and pertinent that the suppository maintains its shape at room temperature, generally which is 25 degrees centigrade, and it should soften below 30 degrees centigrade. As when it enters into the body at 37 degrees, when it reaches and it is out of the temperature of the room which is 25 degrees, the suppository gets softened, and with the body temperature it softens and melts. The second ideal characteristic which a suppository base should fulfill is it should melt at a body temperature in order that the drug comes out of the suppository, either it disperses into the body fluids or it is because of the release of drug on melting. The third characteristic which an ideal suppository base should fulfill is it should have a narrow and a sharp melting point range. Means to say that whenever a suppository base is melted, it should melt at a smaller temperature range, and when the heat is withdrawn, it should also solidify immediately. This helps in keeping the drug dispersion uniformly distributed in the suppository base, and ultimately it gives us a uniformity in the dosage. The next characteristic is it should also be easy to remove from the mold without sticking to the mold. I wish to quote an example here about candle making. So, when we pour the molten base in the molds and we try to cool it and try to remove the mold covers and get the suppository out, it is also important that slightly the suppository should shrink so that when it is pushed with the finger, it comes out with ease without deforming the suppository. The next quality which a suppository base should have is undoubtedly it should be stable on storage, and also it should be stored, it should be stable when it is heated above the melting point. It is observed that some compounds, when they are heated or exposed to excess of heat, they show changes in their crystal form. So, ideally a suppository base is not supposed to show any change which would impact the physico-chemical characteristic of the suppository. The next quality which we look into is it should have good wettability, it should also have the emulsifying properties and should have the ability to hold high water number. This is very important because when it comes in contact with body fluids, it should have the ability to have good wetting quality so that it gets into solution, and also it should have a broader emulsifying range so that it takes into account number of drugs which are of insoluble nature and give a uniform dispersions, and also has a good water holding capacity so that it swells and releases the drug due to the loosening of the compressed mass. The next ideal quality which we look into is it should be compatible. It is one and most important quality which any excipient used in a dosage form should have is compatibility. If it is compatible, it will gel along with other ingredients which are added, and the interference with the release or absorption of drug will be bare minimum. The last quality which we emphasize is it should also be safe when used. It should not cause any irritation to the rectal mucosa, and it should not bring in any kind of sensitivity reactions to the mucous membrane. So, holistically speaking, an ideal suppository base should fulfill all the qualities so as to make it useful and get a stable and a very effective suppository dosage form. Having understood the qualities of a suppository base, we now get into what are the different types of bases. The bases can be classified based on their nature. First and foremost is an oleaginous base. As the name indicates, oleaginous bases are oil-based bases. So, when they are oil-based, they do not dissolve. They in fact melt at body temperature, and that is the mechanism by which the drug which is loaded in such bases come out. So, to quote some examples or the subtypes under such oleaginous bases, the classical example is cocoa butter, and the second category is cocoa butter substitutes, or we simply call them as synthetic fats. Apart from oleaginous bases, we have second class of bases which are referred as hydrophilic bases. As the name indicates, these are water based. So, these are water loving in nature, and they are subclassified into water soluble bases, example gelato-glycerine bases, or simply we call them as soap glycerine bases, and macrogol bases. The second type under hydrophilic bases are water dispersible bases, and the examples are generally we call them as emulsifying bases. So, in order to understand how they are different from oleaginous bases, as the name specifies, these are hydrophilic bases which are water loving. So, these bases either will dissolve or disperse in the body fluids, as majority of our body fluids have high content of water. So, they bring in dispersion of the drug and also enhance the solubility of the drug because of the solubility factor and also the emulsification ability. So, having classified the different types of bases, we need to understand each type of bases, its characteristics, its merits and its demerits. So, to start with, under the first category, which is an oleaginous base, and the classical example first among it is cocoa butter. Cocoa butter has a synonym which is also referred as theobroma oil. So, in general or a layman's language, we are able to correlate with this base by the name theobroma oil. Now, this is a naturally occurring triglyceride. So, as it is well understood that triglycerides is nothing but a glycerol having three different fatty acids attached to it. Generally, palmitic acid, stearic acid and oleic acids are used. So, when we have cocoa butter being obtained naturally and also nowadays prepared semi-synthetically, they are unsaturated in nature, and by nature they are solid in state. So, we simply refer them as solid fats. Now, the characteristic of such fats or such compounds is that they melt between a temperature range of 30 degrees to 35 degrees Celsius, which is very little less than the regular normal human body temperature. Now, this is very advantageous because at 25 degrees, which is the room temperature, it is in solid state, but when it is inserted in the body and it comes across a temperature between 30 to 35 degrees, it starts melting, and at regular body temperature, which happens to be 37 degree, it becomes liquid in state, and by this the drug comes out of the oily mass, and this oil also helps in emulsification and cross the body membranes, because majority of the body membranes are lipophilic in nature. So, the drug gets into liquid state, that is, it gets into the body fluids, and parallelly the drug also gets an advantage of crossing the biological membranes. So, the purpose is through suppository dosage forms, even systemically needed drugs or bioavailability of drugs for systemic use are also targeted. Often these type of bases are used for rectal suppositories rather than for vaginal or urethral purpose. These bases are preferred for rectal administration. Now, having understood the characteristics of cocoa butter, it is not devoid or it is not left with any limitations. So, we need to also focus on what are the challenges when we use cocoa butter as a base. So, the most common challenges or the limitations which we come across is, first and foremost, its variation, because being from natural source, there is considerable batch to batch variation in its composition and also its physico-chemical properties. Now, physico-chemical properties is something which we cannot have much scope of variation, because it loses the faith of the patient in the product. The patient goes by the brand and the brand goes by the quality. If the quality is compromised because of variation in physico-chemical property, the consumer or the patient faith and the purpose and the therapeutic benefit is lost. So, for this reason, this becomes a major challenge, that because of its natural source and batch to batch variation, the usage of theobroma oil is big under question. The next challenge or the disadvantage is it has unsaturation. So, as I said, they are basically made up of triglycerides. So, the unsaturation part, when it is exposed to oxygen, which is generally present in the atmospheric air, they are prone to undergo rancidification. So, they undergo oxidation reactions when they are exposed to air, light, and they turn into a rancid mass which smells foul, and also it loses its physico-chemical characteristics. So, that is a major challenge. So, that is the reason we have the next substitutes which we call them as cocoa butter substitutes. The third limitation with respect to cocoa butter is it exhibits temperature dependent polymorphism. As we all know, polymorphic forms of the drug bring in changes in physico-chemical characteristics. So, when a base is heated in order to incorporate the drug and again get it to set on cooling, the base may show changes in its characteristic properties because of its change in crystal form. So, that is something which is not advantageous, because when the crystal form changes from one form to another, the base loses its characteristic properties. So, this is a very common tendency seen with cocoa butter, that when it is exposed to slight variation or little higher temperature, it undergoes polymorphism. The next challenge is that it is immiscible with body fluids and its water holding capacity is poor, because of which it will only depend on temperature for its dispersing the drug out of it, as it has to undergo melting, but otherwise it is not very miscible with body fluids because of its oily or lipophilic nature, and they are fatty based, so they may not get into solution state. So, drug holding becomes longer and the therapeutic benefit is lost. And parallelly, one more mess is with respect to it cannot hold more of water, so it does not show swelling property. So, when there is no swelling, the drug movement or diffusion out of the mass is less. So, for that reason it is only based on temperature of the body. Next challenge is that certain soluble drugs, especially drugs like volatile oils, they depress the melting point. Now, when the melting point of cocoa butter is depressed, it becomes very soft and malleable when it is handled by the patient for insertion, which is not a good characteristics. As we said that 30 to 35 degree is its general melting range, but when a soluble drug is added to it, its melting point depresses, it goes less than 30 degrees. So, even at room temperature, sometimes we find that the cocoa butter suppositories become very soft and they lose its shape. The next disadvantage with respect to cocoa butter is because of its tendency of becoming soft and transforming into a melted mass, it may also leak out of the body. So, when it leaks out of the body, it is a very unpleasant feeling and discomfort to the patient, and also it is not miscible with the aqueous secretions, which is a normal phenomena in the body. So, that's the reason why it is not used for urethral and vaginal use. So, there could be an MCQ asked that why cocoa butter is preferred only for rectal administration and not for vaginal or urethral use. So, this is the answer, that because of its tendency to show lower melting point when soluble drugs are added, it loses its characteristics and it might become soft, or it may turn into a melted liquid form, and that may leak out of the body. So, that is the reason it is only inserted into the rectum and recommended for rectal suppositories. Next challenge is, it is also liable to melt in warm climates. Now, India is a tropical country. Now, since we have a variation of temperature from 0 degree to 50 degrees. So, we have states in India where we come across temperature going less than 0 degree and also in summers touching to 50 degrees. So, when we have such a wide range of temperature variations in one country and the product is to be kept in different states, definitely when it comes across a temperature which is above 35 degrees, the storage becomes challenging. Such suppositories will start melting and it would be losing its characteristics. So, that is the reason this is not recommended, and especially when the temperature is warm and especially in warmer or climatic conditions which demands its proper storage conditions. And the last variation or the last problem which we come across with cocoa butter is low contractility. So, later on we will be discussing about the methods of preparation, in which we have first method which is very classically used is molding. So, whenever we use molds, we want that the base should have little shrinking capacity. So, if it shrinks, then when the molds are set open after the base has set, it is important that it can be taken out from the mold with minimum of pressure, so that it retains its characteristic. Now, the challenge with cocoa butter is, because it has low contractility, after solidification it has the tendency to stick on to the mold, and when you are applying pressure to release it from the mold, it may break, and because of which now you need to lubricate the mold surface so that it does not stick. And sometimes this lubricant which is used may also hinder drug release from the molded suppository. Again, we have two more challenges which we can mention here is low solidification point. Now, low solidification point is a disadvantage, especially when we have to incorporate insoluble drug. So, as I mentioned in the ideal characteristics, that the variation of temperature should be narrow range so that it melts soon and it sets also faster. The reason being that when a drug is getting dispersed in such a melted mass, and if the solidification temperature range is wider, by the time it sets, the insoluble moiety settles down and it may lead to ununiform or a kind of dosage form where dose uniformity cannot be attained. So, for that reason it is very important that low solidification point is a challenge, and the drugs especially which are insoluble, incorporation becomes a big challenge to accommodate. And finally, as it is from having a fats as its base, it has a disagreeable odor and the color is yellow to white color. Neither it is totally yellow nor it is pure white. So, the patient acceptance is not very good because it is somewhere between yellow to white and it gives a feeling that the product is old or stale. So, having understood the lot of limitations with respect to cocoa butter or theobroma oil, the next type of bases were synthesized. So, these are synthetic in nature. The previous one was natural from source, and because of the limitations of cocoa butter, lab process was taken into account and synthetic fatty bases have been used. So, that is second category under oleaginous bases. So, these are nothing but combinations of fats and waxes and they are prepared after hydrogenation. Now, the main advantage of having hydrogenation process is that the unsaturation which we saw under cocoa butter is taken care of. So, the advantage or the merit is that when these are hydrogenated bases and even they come in contact with air or light, their rancidification tendency becomes less and their stability increases, because of which synthetic fatty bases are preferred over simple natural base, which is cocoa butter. So, hydrogenation is a process wherein we bring fats and waxes together and also to increase the resistance towards rancidification and to also have limited kind of chemical interference when other excipients are added. So, more the unsaturation, the more is the instability and more is the challenge with respect to defining the shelf life of the product. So, from manufacturing aspect and we scale up the production, it is important that the expiry dating should have a bigger window and a stable formulation should be obtained. So, let us look into some of the examples of synthetic fatty bases, under which we have first type, which we call it as Vitepsol. Now, Vitepsol bases are nothing but mixtures of triglycerides of natural saturated fatty acids, wherein the carbon range is from carbon 12 to 18. So, 12 carbon atoms to 18 carbon atoms and partial glycerides. So, here the total unsaturation is taken care and partial glycerides are attached, and their melting point range is something which is in the range of cocoa butter, which is ideal. So, it is between 33 degrees centigrade to 35 degrees centigrade. So, this is very widely used under synthetic fatty bases. The second example under the same category is Suppository. Now, Suppository bases are nothing but again they are fats and waxes, wherein the carbon chain ranges from C10 to C18, but the main advantage is they are saturated in nature with mono, di and triglycerides, which are obtained by hydrogenation mechanism and also by taking care of reactions which is called as interesterification of vegetable oils. Now, when we bring in esterification of all these triglycerides, mono, di nature, we try to saturate the fatty acids which are attached to the glycerol moiety. So, because of which the rancidification problem also is taken care of. But the synthetic fatty bases also have some of the limitations which need to be understood. So, in our next series, we will be touching upon the limitations of synthetic waxes in the upcoming series.